Hey guys, welcome back to another How I Watch Fights. This time I'll be talking with Sean Carey of the Half the Battle podcast. Last week, when I interviewed Mike Jeans, we talked all about everything you ever wanted to know about MMA statistics, and this week we're going to be talking about the repeating patterns and angles that happen again and again in the fight game over the course of combat sports history. I posted this last week right after I recorded the Mike Jeans How I Watch Fights on Statistics, and it got me thinking about the recent election and how Nate Silver and his statistic based model were completely wrong, while Professor Prediction, Alan Lichtman, who has predicted every election successfully since 1984 and uses 13 points based on history, things like after 8 years of a Democratic president, there's usually a Republican swingback and other stuff like that, was totally right and was one of the only people to predict the president winning. So, in this way, it got me thinking about how Mike Jeans is similar to MMA's Nate Silver, while Sean is like MMA betting's Alan Lichtman. And I don't mean that as a shot at Mike at all, who I'm a huge fan of, as everyone knows, but more that there are things beyond statistics and beyond numbers that affect the fight game. And I think Mike himself even admitted as much in the statistics episode of How I Watch Fights. And Sean really is great, maybe the best I've seen or heard, at finding those angles that repeat themselves over and over, whether it's boxing or MMA. Sean got into watching fights through boxing, which he participated in from 12 until 28. He told me that he was the guy who was leaving parties in high school and college to go watch fights on HBO. At 18, he made his first big fight bet, $300 on the Ike Quartey versus Oscar De La Hoya fight. And he lost. But he got bit by the betting bug. He's also been a UFC fan since the very beginning, UFC 1, which he ordered and watched on pay-per-view. Respect. Sean told me that he wakes up early in the morning and watches fights on his phone with a cigarette while his family is still asleep. He watches 5 fights total, a fighter's 3 most recent fights, along with his best win and worst loss, and he's looking for things like similar matchups to whoever he's fighting in his next bout. I asked Sean what he looks for, and he broke it down into the macro, the big picture stuff, and the micro, the smaller picture stuff. The macro are things like context. What does the fight mean to each fighter? What point of the career is each fighter at? Is this something where if they win it, it's on to bigger, better things? Or is this something where everything is going against them? Did they make any changes to their camp, training, etc. since their last win or loss? Context is everything for Sean. Second, have you had stuff go wrong? How do you react to getting hit? How do you react to bad situations? Have you been in a bad spot and had to persevere and push your way through? And third, he looks for gaps. And we'll talk about micro gaps in a second, but he describes macro gaps as a situation where one fighter's super tough and has crazy cardio, and the other guy's a front runner. So Brian Barberena versus Warley Alves, for example, shows a macro gap where the fight could be decided by one thing a fighter has and something else his opponent lacks. Moving on to the micro, Sean will look at things like, how does your face react to getting hit? Do you just take punches? Do you try to bullshit and shake it off? Or, like Ronda Rousey, do you get the deer in the headlights look? Fight IQ. Will the fighter actually do what you think he's going to do? If there's a clear path to victory, are they going to take that? Or are they going to get caught up in some macho thing and try to show them they can stand with the far better striker? He gives the example of Rustem Kabalov being a time traveler because no matter what, he's going to stick to the plan, get that takedown, and erase 2 minutes off the clock every single time. Those are the type of fighters that you want to bet on, the ones that are predictable. And as I mentioned earlier, micro gaps. These are little technical things that a fighter does wrong that could be exploitable. Things like dropping his left after throwing a jab, throwing a left hook on clinch breaks, etc. Now, I asked Sean if he has a limit on plays per card, and he said he doesn't, but he only bets 10% of his bankroll per event, max. He also noted that if you have 5 plays and you feel super confident about 3 of them and just okay about 2 of them, you should just put all of your money into the 3 plays you're super confident about rather than trying to diversify or spread out the risk. I asked Sean what the best thing he does when it comes to MMA betting is, and he said, staying the course. He explained that when he has an opinion, he's willing to keep testing it, even if it doesn't turn out to be true right away. Even if it doesn't turn out to be true the first 5 times, Sean is willing to stay the course, and because of that, he ends up hitting some huge wins. He gave 3 examples. Derek Brunson. He could see that Derek Brunson was swinging away with his chin in the air, so he started to take shots on fighters against Derek Brunson. He took the shot on Sam Alvey, didn't quite work. Took the shot on Uriah Hall, didn't quite work. Then it took the shot on Robert Whittaker and had a huge win. Same thing for Ronda Rousey when he saw that she was starting to do movies and she wasn't paying attention to fighting so much. Didn't work when she fought Beth Correa, but nice big win when she fought Holly Holm. And Anderson Silva, he decided that Anderson Silva was totally done after the second Chris Weidman fight. Bet on Nick Diaz, didn't quite work. Bet on Michael Bisping, nice big win. So things like that show that Sean is willing to really stay true to his hypothesis, and he's willing to lose a couple of times in order to be early on the trend and get that big dog money. The thing about Sean that made him so interesting to me and why I wanted to interview him was the way he finds time tested angles that have echoed true throughout the history of fight sports and is able to relate those to upcoming fights. I wanted to get as many angles as possible, so I really grilled Sean, and he ended up giving me his 5 most common angles. The long layoff versus the fire. This angle happens when one fighter is coming off a long layoff and their first fight back is against an aggressive, dangerous finisher. We just saw the long layoff versus the fire when Ronda Rousey came back against Amanda Nunes and got that hashtag beat him down. We also have another long layoff versus the fire Super Bowl weekend when the Korean Zombie, coming off a 3+ year layoff, is going to jump right back into the deep end of the division by fighting aggressive, hard-hitting Dennis Bermudez. When you see a fighter coming off a long layoff against a fighter who is aggressive and can finish, that's a chance to lay some money on the layoff versus fire angle and get paid. One guy's Super Bowl. This is an angle that happens when the fight is super big for one guy. It's the biggest fight of his career, and for the other guy, it's just another fight. A great example of one guy's Super Bowl was when Jimmy Rivera fought Uriah Faber. Jimmy Rivera, leading up to that fight, was giving quotes about how he had, grown up watching Uriah Faber and thought about fighting him, his whole life. While Uriah Faber, it was just another contender fight, and the results showed that out. So when a fight is way more important career-wise, way more important recognition-wise, way more important money-wise for one guy than the other guy, that's a good chance to bet on the guy who has more to lose. Bump your head on the ceiling. This is one of my favorite angles that Sean talked to me about because this is an angle that happens when a guy has already gotten a title shot, not quite been able to get it done, and then has to continue to fight. And it becomes a question of motivation. So a guy like Joseph Benavidez, right? He's already lost to Dominic Cruz at 135. He's lost twice to DJ at 125. So he's really bumped his head on the ceiling. He's hit the highest point of his abilities, and he's not quite good enough to be a champion. Chad Mendes, another guy who bumped his head on the ceiling. So when you get a guy who's bumped his head on the ceiling, and then you get him fighting a fighter similar to the Super Bowl who's on the way up, who has more motivation to beat him than the guy who's already bumped his head on the ceiling and kind of seen the high end of his ability levels, that's another great situation to jump on the bet because the guy who's bumped his head on the ceiling has nowhere to go but down. Home cooking, maybe the oldest angle in fight sports. Fighters who are fighting at home and go to the judges are more likely to win a decision. And there's a million examples of that. The UFC had a big problem with this for a little while when they first started going to Brazil, and if it went to the cards, the Brazilian fighter would just win no matter what. And lastly, out with the old. So we've had a couple examples of this recently where the UFC just will blatantly throw a old fighter with a name out there with an up-and-coming lion. We saw this with BJ Penn and Yair Rodriguez, and we just saw this last weekend with Francis Ngannou and Andrei Arlovski, where they're just like, there's no country for old men here. So old men got to either perform or hit the bricks. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay in the UFC. So when you see an old guy matched up against a young, hungry up-and-comer, another chance to make some money. I asked Sean if he used any stats or math to make predictions at all, and he said he doesn't, which is pretty interesting. He just sets his own lines, and that's it. When I asked Sean about other cappers or other people he listens to, he said that he actually specifically doesn't listen to anyone. He'll tune out all other voices about a fight or, series of fights he's interested in and do his tape study and line setting 2 weeks before the fight. Then, when the odds open, he'll bet a fighter if the line is better than the one he set himself. The further the line is away from what he set, the more he bets. This helps him make predictions, but also leads to getting carried, when you make a bet as soon as the lines open, only to watch the price get much, much better as you miss out on that additional value because you placed your bet right away rather than waiting and seeing if the price gets better. There is, however, a method to the madness. The reason Sean does it this way is because he used to look at the lines when they came out, and if they were way off of what he set himself, he would talk himself out of the bet, thinking that the lines makers knew something that he didn't. Since Sean started doing his predictions 2 weeks ahead of time, he no longer has to deal with that problem. I asked Sean if he does props and parlays, and he said he does both, but he has a few rules for each. When it comes to props, he won't bet by knockout or submission, and instead will only bet inside the distance or goes to decision. He sees these as safer props since you're covered either way if the KO or the submission happens, and you're usually only getting a 30 or 40 cent price difference. So for a little bit of extra money, you can end up being covered no matter how the fight ends, or if the fight goes to decision. With parlays, Sean hates juice, and he never bets anything over minus 130, so he only bets plus money parlays, where he only needs to hit about 45% of the time to be profitable. One of my favorite quotes from the Sean interview was that if you can't pick two outcomes, slap them together, and hit 45% of the time, you probably don't need to be gambling on MMA. We talked a little about totals, and he said that he thinks the two safest bets are women's fights over, which we talked about a lot with Mike, and open parlays, where if you find one thing you love on a card, like Sean just did an open parlay with Chidi and Jakwani, and just added Dennis Bermudez, the layoff versus the fire fight. So you leave your parlay open, wait until there's a card where there is something you like, and you can add it later and be guaranteed a profit rather than trying to shoehorn in another bet that you're not really crazy about to make your parlay work. Sean also does what's called round robin bets, where he'll take 4 or more outcomes he thinks are likely but may not win outright and stick them into 6 two-parlay bets for 0.4 units each. The goal is to get 3/4 right, and you're rolling in cash. Sean has won up to 25 units on a single round robin bet. So that's something I definitely want to start doing because sometimes you have a hunch that something's going to go to decision or that this guy's going to win, but it's not enough that you actually want to bet a full unit on it. So this way, you can bet, 3 or 4 of these things for between 1.8 units and 2.4 units rather than the 4 or 5 units it would cost you otherwise. Lastly, I asked Sean what his best advice would be for beginning bettors, and he said that you have to watch the fights. He's been watching fights for over 20 years, and that really gives him a lot of knowledge base to draw upon, and one of the reasons he's able to find historical precedents for some of these predictions. The longer you watch, the more you know, the more you see the same storylines unfolding over and over again, whether it's old fighters on the way out or the layoff versus the fire. You see predictable trends over and over and over again in the history of the fight game. The angles stay the same. Man, I hope you had as much fun and learned as much watching this video as I did talking to Sean. You can hear Sean on the Half the Battle podcast with Dan Levy every week. Dan Levy, who was on the first How I Watch Fights, who've now interviewed the whole podcast. So shout out to those guys for being super helpful and super good gamblers. You can follow him on betmma.tips at www.betmma.tips/thunderdickpicks. You can see the URL right here on the screenshot. And Sean wanted to make a point to let you know that he's been tracking his bets for like 3 or 4 years. And he does that because he wants to show people what gambling looks like, to show you what the highs look like, what the lows look like, and paint a realistic portrait of what is possible and what is realistic. So definitely check out his tracking. It goes back quite a few years, and you'll get a very realistic portrait of what it looks like to bet on MMA long term. Also, be sure to follow him on Twitter at Sean Carey Tattoo. He's hysterical, and you'll definitely laugh in addition to getting to see his fight pics. Thanks for watching How I Watch Fights number 5. I'll be back next week with another How I Watch Fights. Be sure to give me a thumbs up, like this video on Twitter, retweet it, share it, and leave me a comment. And I'll be back to talk to you very soon.